British business confidence has hit a two-year low, and that's not the reception the coalition government was hoping for in handing down a budget aimed at stimulating growth. Anger over ongoing budget cuts came to a climax at the weekend when anarchists crashed demonstrations in London. And more bad news is forecast for Tuesday, when data is likely to show that the UK economy shrank more than first thought last quarter. Well, to examine the challenges, we're joined now by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Danny Alexander. Danny, welcome.
Thank you.
If we look at the slowing growth that we've seen, and also the protests at the weekend, protests against the austerity cuts, we've seen them elsewhere in Europe. The ones here in London were much larger than we expected. Does it give you pause for thought that there is no plan B, that there is nothing else except these austerity measures?
Well, the first point you raised about the growth forecast, of course, in the budget last week, we set out the new forecast from the Office for Budget Responsibility, and they do show growth this year forecast to be a little bit slower than was the case last year, but they also show strong growth forecast for next year and getting stronger the years after that. And I think that takes into account the impact of our plans. And let's not forget, of course, that we have a real big problem in our economy with the size of our deficit. We've got a larger deficit than countries like Portugal, Greece and other countries in Europe, and yet we've managed to have keep our interest rates very low indeed, and that I think is because of the credibility that we've established with the plan that we set out last June and which we've stuck to in this budget. Of course, you're quite right to mention the protests, and I understand why people are concerned, because of course the spending cuts that we are having to make do have an impact on people's lives. But I think we have to keep getting out there and explaining why it is in the interests of the people of this country that we stick with the plans that we've set out.
The argument, of course, is that you don't have to cut this quickly. You could still keep the markets on side by cutting just a little bit slower and allowing a little bit more breathing space at the moment. And that's the concern, that it almost seems that the idea of eliminating the deficit is the goal, regardless of what else falls by the wayside in terms of growth and jobs.
Well, as I say, the forecasts that come off the back of the plan that we've set out show growth increasing over the next few years. They show unemployment falling from the end of this year onwards. Let's think about what the consequences would have been if the Chancellor had stood up last week and said we are stepping away from our plan. I think you would have seen a real loss of confidence, a loss of credibility, a lack of the stability that we have that is the foundation for growth in this country. And what it would also mean, of course, is more cuts for longer and more debt interest and more debt built up in the meantime. So actually, if you do spread this out over a much longer period, as some people I know are arguing, then actually what you find is you have to do more cutting for a longer period of time, and that would affect people much more severely in the end.
Can you see why people are angry, though, particularly when you look at what's happening in Libya? I know this has become very contentious over the last few days, and George Osborne was speaking about it just today. It is costing, in his words, it's going to cost, sort of tens of millions. Other people are saying hundreds of millions, and the figures, I'm sure you know them very well. There's a very long list of very expensive weapons and planes that are being flown every day. And as concern grows that this isn't quite what it set out to be at the beginning, as a Liberal Democrat, how do you feel about the amount of money that's being spent on this campaign at the moment that therefore cannot be spent in these very austere times, cannot be spent on nurses and on hospitals and on education?
Well, as a Liberal Democrat, I'm 100% behind the action that we have taken. I think it was absolutely right to step up to help ensure that people in Benghazi and elsewhere were not massacred as they otherwise would have been by Colonel Gaddafi. We have a very strong legal basis for this with the United Nations resolution. We had the opportunity to act, and we should do so. And the Chancellor's right to say that we expect, on the basis of the forecasts of the Ministry of Defence, that this will cost tens of millions of pounds. But let me reassure everyone watching this programme, this is not going to mean a penny cut from other public services. The whole point of running a contingency reserve, which we do, that's money that's set aside to deal with unexpected events. This is clearly something that was unexpected, and so that money will be used for this. It's not going to result in a single nurse or school or any of the other things you mentioned being affected one iota.
Now, talking about unusual events, in the budget, we saw that extra money being taken from the North Sea oil producers, and while most people, all petrol users will understand that and applaud it, of course, those companies weren't happy with it. Can you see that there is a bit of a conflict when you say that Britain is open for business and that really trying to encourage businesses to come here, and yet then you get this uncertainty that if a business is doing particularly well, you might give them a bit of a windfall tax.
I don't see it as a conflict at all. I think that there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of small businesses across this country who are very directly affected by the price of fuel at the pumps. I mean, I met a distribution firm in my own constituency in the Highlands just on Saturday, and they were saying that as a result of this, they were going to make savings in terms of the costs that they'd expected to have over the next year, because they'd factored in the 5p duty rise that the previous government has planned.
If you're a North Sea oil producer, then you weren't expecting to have
yes,
to pay extra.
What I'm saying first of all, that what we did on fuel duty, cutting fuel duty for the first time in many years, turning back the previous government's planned 5p increase, is not just good for motorists, it's also good for business too. And looking at the North Sea, there are significant extra profits being made in the North Sea because of the international price of oil rising very dramatically. When the regime, as it previously was put in place back in 2006, oil price was around $60 a barrel. It's now, over $113, $115 a barrel. There are 24 billion pounds of profit expected to be made in the North Sea over the next 12 months. We expect that oil companies, even with this new tax regime in place, will make more profit.
They can well afford it.
They'll make more profit per barrel of oil than they over the next 5 years than they did over the last 5 years. So I think it is a fair exchange, if you like, to ask those who are doing well from the high price of oil to pay a little bit more to help those businesses who are really under pressure as a result of it.
I'd like to ask you about the 50% tax that George Osborne brought up. He sort of brought it up and then left it dangling there, that it may be axed at some point in the future. And the Lib Dems have said that that would sort of be okay if there was a property tax put in place. Could you expand on that a little bit more? How are you going to tax property?
Well, what the Chancellor said in the budget was that we were going to look at the revenues from the 50p, that we'd all taken the view, both Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, that this is something that we saw as temporary rather than a permanent feature of our tax system. But he also made the point that there is a problem in this country, which is that very wealthy people in very large properties often find ways to dodge the taxes that they should be paying, and that's something we're going to look at over the next few months alongside.
You don't know how you're going to do it yet.
Alongside looking at the 50p rate. We're going to look at it, as the Chancellor said. There are no particular policy options on the table, but it clearly is a problem when multi-millionaires can transact their properties through offshore companies and not a single penny of tax is paid in the UK.
One last question. We've seen what happened in Germany at the weekend. Portugal doesn't have a government. Ireland's government fell on the basis of the sovereign debt issues. We've got this AV vote coming up. How strong is the coalition government at the moment in this country? You've got a lot of pain to face with all these austerity measures.
Well, I think you're right to say that Britain is fortunate to have a strong and stable government to see it through these difficult times.
I didn't say that. I said, how strong is it?
And the AV referendum is something that we committed ourselves to in the coalition agreement. We're all Democrats. We will accept the result of the referendum as it comes. It'll be a matter for the British people to choose how they want to address that. I hope people will vote yes. But we've all made clear that this coalition is for 5 years. We are there to see through the difficult choices we've made, to get the economy back on track, to deliver the changes to British society that we want, the greater freedom, the greater localism, the changes to our political system.
And there are no chinks in the armour at the moment.
All those things are important to us as a coalition. But most important is that we are committed to this enterprise for 5 years to deliver on the promises that we set out. And whatever the result of the AV referendum, it will not change that.
Okay. Danny Alexander, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.